Welcome to this month's genealogy class. In honor of Black History Month, we're going to learn about African American research. Researching African American ancestors can be especially challenging. It requires research skill and creativity. To learn about enslaved ancestors, it is necessary to research the slave owner's family, since most of the records where slaves may be named, such as probate, account, and deed records, will be the slave owner's records. To learn about African ancestors who were free before emancipation, you're going to face unique challenges because records are dispersed and can be difficult to navigate. The process of locating African American ancestors can be time-consuming, but the effort and the results are extremely rewarding. Here's what we're going to cover today: research barriers caused by slavery, research principles, how far back can you go, genealogy and new DNA discoveries, surnames, free people of color, post-1865 research, pre-1865 research, and the resources we have here at Northwest Library. Now, I've talked about pre and post-1865, and that's because 1865 was a pivotal year. It was the year that the Civil War ended. It was 2 years after emancipation. It was the date Reconstruction began, and also the date the Freedmen's Bureau began operations. As you'll learn, records pre-1865 are much more challenging than the records post-1865. You can't assume that your ancestors were enslaved without finding evidence. There were hundreds of thousands of free people in the North and South before the Civil War. Don't go down research rabbit holes looking for an enslaved ancestor if there wasn't one. If you did have enslaved ancestors, you aren't looking for evidence of the existence of people. You're tracing the way property changed hands. Think about any property you own today, your house or your car. There are records associated with those items of property. So there are records associated with slaves, but those records are in the slave owner's name because slaves legally at that time were chattel property. Now, as you begin tracing your family history, the steps are the same no matter what race, nationality, or ethnic group your ancestors were. Here are some of the basic principles of genealogical research. You work from the known to the unknown. You're going to work backwards through time gradually without skipping generations. You're going to start with oral history and family artifacts before you move on to the documentary records. Then you're going to use census records and then later fill in with other types of records. Be sure to research your collateral lines, aunts, siblings, cousins, etc., because these collateral lines can give you clues that'll help you pound through brick walls that you might encounter if you just only went straight back through your direct ancestors. Use ordinary genealogy records until you stop finding information. Then you can use DNA to help you keep going. Your thoroughness post-1870 is going to increase the odds of your success before 1870. How far back you can go keeps improving over time. Henry Louis Gates's 2015 Finding Your Roots book said that most African Americans can trace to 1870, and 10 to 15% can go back to the 18th century and to Africa. That percentage is probably higher now, but I don't know exactly what it is. Ongoing data gathering projects such as slavevoyages.org keep increasing the amount of records that are available. Slavevoyages.org includes the transatlantic, intra-American, and African names databases. The transatlantic slave database includes data on 36,000 voyages that occurred from 1514 through 1866. The intra-American database documents intra-American networks of forced migration. The African American names database has over 90,000 Africans and their names in it. These databases make possible new geographic, ethnic, and linguistic data on peoples captured in Africa and pulled into the slave trade. DNA is a huge help once documents fail. African ancestry says it can trace to a specific African country or ethnic group over 500 years ago. Speaking of DNA, each one of us has a rich, messy, and complex genetic heritage, and we're far more connected than we ever realized. A 2014 study of 23andMe customers who identified as African, European, and Latino showed statistical averages for each group. For African Americans, statistically, are 73.2% African, 24% European, and 0.8% African American. For European Americans, at least 3.5% of them are at least 1% African. Latinos are 18% Native American, 65% European, and 6.2% African. Now, of course, these are just averages. That doesn't reflect any one individual. And the image on the slide is from my 23andMe ancestry report, which shows that I'm among the 3.5% of European Americans who are at least 1% African. Dr. Gates, on Finding Your Roots, often uses DNA evidence to supplement documentary research. His show has expanded America's sense of itself, starting a national conversation about identity with his humor, wisdom, and compassion that he displays on the show. Now, did slaves keep the enslaver's surname? If you assume that your ancestor did keep the enslaver's surname after emancipation, you can really throw your research off. Finding the slave owner's surname is critical in your research, as you will see. One study, based on 696 ex-slave testimonies before 3 Civil War commissions, said that 71% had kept the enslaver's surname. Other scholars argue that only 15% kept the enslaver's surname. Sometimes people changed their surnames more than once, or 2 brothers might have taken different surnames. People pick surnames for all kinds of different reasons. They might have kept an enslaver's surname. They might have adopted the surname of a prominent family. They might have adopted one based on a personal attribute, their occupation, a place name, or a name that had meaning for them. But as I've already mentioned, not all African Americans were slaves. Many African Americans' ancestors were free people of color. In one episode of Finding Your Roots, film director Ava DuVernay's ancestors were free people of color who came from Haiti. There's a website in my African American Genealogy handout that's called Free African Americans of North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware. And that's a really good place to look for free people of color. And keep in mind that free people of color may have been undercounted by at least 20%, which is understandable. They probably tried to fly under the radar as much as possible to avoid becoming enslaved. As you look at census records, keep in mind that early census records did not distinguish between different races and ethnic groups. They lumped anyone with brown skin together in one category. In 1860 North Carolina, there were 1,300 free people of color who were farmers. 1/3 of the North Carolina free people of color lived in towns and cities. And the statistics that I just mentioned to you are from John Hope Franklin's The Free People in North Carolina, 1790 through 1860. And that's a real interesting book on that topic. Some free people of color were immigrants from the West Indies and the Caribbean. Some slaves ran away and lived with Indian tribes, becoming free people of color that way. And the Library of Virginia has free Negro registers for many cities and counties that are on microfilm. So there's all kinds of places to look for that. Now, as I mentioned before, post-1865 research is like any genealogy research project. Remembering our research principles of going from known to unknown, present to past, you're going to research ancestors in recent times before you go back to before the Civil War. The information collected by census records changed over time. Very early census records listed only the name of the head of the household, not the names of the wife and the children. 1870 was the first census to identify former slaves by name. The 1880 census listed family relationships for everyone that was mentioned on the census. 1890 listed Union veterans and their widows, and then between 1900 and 1940, The census records gathered many, many more facts. For post-1865 research, there's 5 types of federal records that are particularly a good help. One is the SS5 application, which is the application that you fill out to get your Social Security benefits. Second is military records. The third is Freedmen's Bureau records. The Freedmen's Bureau was part of the Union Army. It replaced Southern government, law enforcement, and institutions because those had been destroyed during the war. The Freedmen's Bureau records include school, marriage, registers of complaints, indentures, labor contracts, correspondence, relief, and transportation requests. The Freedmen's Bank records can show you the name, residence, occupation, relatives, and former enslaver of the person who was doing the banking transaction. Federal land files can tell you where and when your ancestors lived and might name the spouse, relatives, neighbors, occupation, and many other facts. Other helpful records for post-1865 research include the Southern Claims Commission. Now, the Southern Claims Commission existed from 1871 to 1880. It was created by President Grant, and the purpose of it was that sympathizers, Northern sympathizers who lived in the South during the war could apply for reimbursements for property losses during the war, because sometimes the Confederate or even the Union Army would confiscate their property during the war. And then another place you can look is the 1867 state voter registration records. Reconstruction law required each district to register all male citizens of the U.S. over age 21 who were qualified to vote by September 1st, 1867. And then the state adjutant general compiled all the records of the war for both the North and the South. And here at Northwest Library, we have a huge multi-volume set of all those records. Cohabitation records, like the image that you see on the slide, is where former slaves registered their common law marriages during Reconstruction. Now, another good source for post-1865 research is city directories. City directories were common in the early 19th century towns. You can use them to track a family over time, and many included a racial designation. You know, the census records only took place every 10 years, but the city directories were just about every year. They're a rich source of information about occupation, address, other family members. The image on the slide shows that the occupations of the people listed included a saloon worker, a shoemaker, brewer, huckster, finisher, laborer, and a domestic. If you don't see your ancestor listed in the city directory, it may be that they moved away, maybe they died, maybe they didn't want to pay the fee to be included in the city directory, because oftentimes they would charge a fee for that. Maybe they weren't home that day, or maybe their name was misspelled and it's in a different place from where you think it might be. More post-1865 research resources. The 1866 special census required by the U.S. government as part of the Reconstruction process. It had 2 schedules, a colored schedule and a white schedule. Now, only the head of the household was listed by name. The others were only listed by sex and age. But that information is still valuable for pushing back beyond the 1870 barrier. Guardianship records. Laws required free blacks to have a white sponsor and guardian to conduct personal business affairs on their behalf, so you can search for the guardianship records. Also, check 1866 land and tax records to find out who were the large landowners who lived near your ancestor, because these people might have owned slaves. And also, public school records after 1870 are a good source that you can try. Now that we've looked at post-1865 research, let's look at the more challenging pre-1865 research. After emancipation, slaves were turned loose with no property, no land, and really no means to support themselves. So what happened was former slave owners divided their plantations into 20 to 50 acre plots per freedman family. In exchange for land, cabin, and supplies, Sharecroppers raised cash crops, usually cotton, and gave half of the crop to the landlord. The landowners charged high prices for goods bought on credit, and they often charged as much as 70% annual interest on those charges. The sharecropping system led to economic dependency and poverty, but it did give freedmen greater autonomy than they had during slavery. But due to lack of resources, 90% of former slaves did stay near the former slave owner, which makes it easier to figure out who that might have been. Now, researchers call the difficulty of connecting a freed ancestor who shows up in the records during Reconstruction to his or her last slaveholder the 1870 brick wall. So the most critical step in your pre-1865 research is to identify the last enslaver, or at least narrow down a list of candidates. Use land and tax records to find the largest landowners, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Learn the local history of the area to help you make sense of the records you find. Look for migration patterns that white and black families might have shared. The reason why you'll be tracking the enslaver's family is because they are the ones who created the property records about their slaves that are going to help you track your family. Systematically list the white landowning families near your ancestor in 1870. Then check the 1860 U.S. Federal Census population and slave schedules. Were any of the white families on your list enslavers? If so, how many people did they enslave? You might need to use a spreadsheet to organize the information. Repeat this process for 1850 and other census records. Ultimately, you're going to need to create a family tree for the enslavers and keep track of their migrations. It's also important to study the entire neighborhood of the slave-owning families. Who was in the enslaver's household? Who were their neighbors? Were there the same or similar surnames and therefore relatives nearby? Do you see neighbors who were there from census to census? You can scroll through the census images to see the households that surrounded a household that you're focusing on. Find out when and how the enslaver first began to own slaves. Keep in mind that slaves were acquired in several ways: by inheritance, by gift, purchase, or the property of the wife who brought them to the marriage. Find out when the enslaver migrated from one place to another. Find out when the number of slaves suddenly increased other than by births. A tip for tracking the enslaver's family once you have a surname for that family is to check the published family histories and online forums for that surname. There are 4 categories of research that you're going to use in your pre-1865 research. You're going to use legal and public records, business and plantation records, personal and private records, and church records. And there are a number of types of records under some of those categories. Legal and public records has the most types of records, so that's the biggest category we're going to go over. And under that category, there's 11 types that we're going to really briefly touch on: census records, vital records, property and deed records, tax records, wills and probate records, guardianships or orphans courts records, manumission records, free black registers, court records, newspaper records, and slave manifests. I've already mentioned the census several times, but this information is going to help you know what to look for. From 1790 forward, the free people of color were listed in every single census. From 1790 to 1840, the free head of the household was named. Others were just listed by age, gender, and race. And then there were the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules that listed the head of household and then everybody else by age, gender, and race. And then there were also the 1850 and 1860 mortality schedules that you might want to check. Now, the image on the screen is from the 1860 slave schedules from Monroe County, Alabama. I'm going to give you a caveat for vital records. Vital records were not required in Georgia until 1919, and there was no widespread compliance until the 1920s to 1930s. But some localities kept records even earlier than this. So when you research vital records, I would do it in this order. I would look for the death records first, then the marriage records, and then the birth records last. And the reason I would do it this way is that the death records are the easiest to find. The marriage records are the next easiest to find, but the birth records can be very difficult to find. And it's easier to find birth records later than earlier. And also the later records are going to contain more data. Now, very early records were kept by the counties. So search county records first, then search the town and state records. And if you don't have any luck with that, look in the separate colored registers or in the back of white registers where light-skinned African Americans might be listed. If your ancestor is not in the record index, search the record anyway because they might be in the record, but they just weren't included in the index. Property and deed records are going to show land ownership. If a person owned a large amount of land, then it was more likely that they owned slaves. And since slaves were legally chattel property, you're going to look for records of your ancestor in those property transactions. Real property records also document free people of color and later of freedmen who obtained Western lands via the Homestead Act of 1862. Tax records. Poll taxes were later used by Jim Crow laws as a prerequisite for voting to deny African Americans the right to vote. But originally, poll taxes were just a method of taxing each person. The poll of a horse or a cow is the top of its head, so poll just means one tax paid per head. In colonial days, we leased land from the crown, so we had poll taxes instead of property taxes, since we didn't own property at that time. Poll taxes did not distinguish between slave and free. Poll tax records over time show changes in the number of people and in their locations. Another fact on tax records, pre-Civil War tax digests indicate the number of slaves owned. Check to see whether the dates, number, and ages match the records you already have about your ancestors. Keep in mind that the taxable age varied by state, and also people would underreport just like they do now on taxes. Poll tax records did not usually indicate race, and the image on your screen is a Georgia property tax record from 1850. Now, probate and estate records of the slave owner family are one of the best sources of information about your ancestors. And there's a difference between a testate and an intestate estate. A testate estate is where the person who died had a will. And when they have a will, they can name who's going to be the executor, who's going to handle all their affairs. If they had a will, it would go through the probate process a lot faster. And the information about slaves in the will are going to vary. An intestate estate is where somebody died without creating a will. And so because they didn't create a will, they didn't pick out an executor. So there's going to be an administrator who's appointed by the court. And there's more court supervision in an intestate estate, which means you're going to have more documents. So they're actually a richer source of research documents for you. Intestate estates also took longer, especially if there was a minor child involved. Now, if you're looking at a will or intestate information, you might only find my property or all my slaves, or you might get lucky and find given names, full names, information on how and from where the slaves were acquired, the identity and location of slaves that were leased out at that time. Since estate records are the richest source of information about slave ancestors, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this type of record than on some of the others I'm covering. If you understand the steps in the probate process, it's going to help you understand what types of documents you might find and what they mean. So step one is you probate the will, which means take it to the probate court, or if there is no will, you file a petition with the probate judge for letters of administration. Step two is to inventory and list all the property and appraise it, see what it's worth. Step 3, you're going to list the debts owed by the person who died. Step 4, they're going to sell the estate assets to pay off the debts. And then the last step is to distribute the remaining assets to the will beneficiaries if there was a will, or to the heirs at law if there was not a will. Now that you know the steps of probating or administrating an estate, I'm going to list the types of probate records that you can look for. You can find will books and indices. You can find probate record books, probate court minutes, probate packets or files of loose papers. You can find inventory and appraisal papers. You can find the annual accountings that were made by the executor or the administrator. You can find returns of sale for the property that was sold by the administrator or the executor. And then you can find the final settlement and decree of distribution. Another type of legal and public record is guardianship or orphans court records. These are related to probate records because they usually involve appointing a guardian to care for a minor child in his or her property because the parent or parents died without appointing a guardian in their will. That's why you typically see these in an intestate estate where there was no will. The guardian would care for the child and manage the child's property until the child married or reached the age of majority. These records can list slaves by name and give information about their births, deaths, their rental, and the cost of maintenance for them. Manumission records. Manumission was the legal process of freeing a slave. To free a slave, the slave owner would file a manumission document with the local county court. You'll see in a minute the importance of these papers to the freed slaves. Once a slave was freed, the papers had to be on his or her person at all times to prove the free status. If the freed slave moved to a new community, he or she had to show the manumission papers at the courthouse in order to register the manumitted status. Registrations can tell you their name, age, height, complexion, a description of distinguishing characteristics or marks on the head, face, arms, and legs, familial relationships between spouses, parents, and children, how the freedom was obtained, the date the freedom was obtained, the name of the former master, aliases, and maiden names of females. Now, another type of record is court records. Litigation in court has always been the primary way that Americans protect their property. Because at that time slaves were property, there were many court cases filed related to them. Maybe the buyer failed to pay for the slave that he bought. Maybe someone stole a slave or failed to pay the fee for renting the services of the slave. Maybe someone injured the slave that belonged to someone else. Maybe the slaves caused damage to the person or property of someone. Or slaves might have been sold at a sheriff's sale to satisfy the debts that were owed by the enslaver. The document that's on the slide is a Virginia Court of Appeals decision about an estate dispute regarding the division of slaves in an estate. Newspaper records contain excellent information about slaves. You might see announcements of regular sales and estate sales, notices of estate hearings, ads seeking runaway slaves, and notices of sheriff sales of slaves to pay the slave owner's debt. Right now I'm doing a historical research project on the Albany courthouse, and I have seen ads like these in the slave era Albany papers. Slave manifests can give you excellent information about slaves. Though slave importation was banned as of the 1st of January in the year 1808, slaves were still transported from state to state after that date. Westward expansion brought slavery to the Southwest into Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. Planters would buy new land with rich soil and move their entire operation, including their slaves. And people did break the law and import after the ban. If you look at the transatlantic slave database, you can see just how many slaves were transported from Africa after 1808. In 1808 alone, 3,150 captives were taken from Africa by U.S. slave ships. Last year, in an episode of Finding Your Roots, Mr. Gates found documents proving that American musician Questlove's ancestor was imported from Africa in the early 1830s. What information was included on the slave manifests? Slave manifests can tell you the slave's age, height, the date of the manifest, the slave owner's name, the shipper's name, and where they lived, the port of destination, the captain's name, and dates of certification by the collector of customs. Now that we've covered legal and public records, I'm going to show you some other types of records. We're going to look at business and plantation records. Those were more likely to be kept and preserved on large plantations. Most enslavers owned 10 or fewer slaves. A very small percentage owned 100 or more. Larger operations were more likely to keep good records that were preserved over time. Last year, in a Finding Your Roots episode, we learned that actress S. Epatha Murkerson descends from 9 slaves who were owned by Georgetown University. In 1838, 272 enslaved people, including her ancestors, were sold by the Jesuits who ran Georgetown to keep it financially afloat. Her ancestors were sold to 2 different planters in Louisiana. Plantation owners kept records of purchases and sales of slaves, the slaves' births and deaths, slave marriages, slave skills and job assignments, slave medical treatment, food and clothing that was purchased for slaves, and slaves who ran away or were punished. Another type of record is personal and private records, and the best known type of personal records used in genealogy is the family Bible. The image on the screen shows where in 1715, the Blow family, who were from Sussex and Southampton counties of Virginia, kept Bible records that included the births of slaves. 19 births to 4 slaves' mothers were recorded from 1737 to 1763 over 3 generations. Descendants of these slaves can find this and other records in the Blow family papers in the Swim Library in Virginia. Family Bibles are a goldmine of information for African American research. Letters and diaries are another common type of personal and private records. Before the Civil War, John Birdley, who was a rice planter from Grimble, South Carolina, owned 70 to 80 slaves and managed others on family lands. By 1862, many slaves had left his plantation. This entry tells of his decision in 1863 to sell all except a few older slaves. Church records can be a wonderful source of information if you can get them. Generally, Catholic churches kept better records than rural Protestant churches. In church records, you can find dates of baptism, dates that they were admitted to church membership, dates of marriages, and deaths. The image on the slide is of St. John's Chapel in Sweet Springs, West Virginia. St. John's Chapel is the oldest Catholic church in West Virginia still in use. Built in the late 1850s, it ministered to wealthy Catholic landowners, Irish workers, Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad workers, and African American Catholics of that area. Now that we've taken a whirlwind tour of the many types of records useful in African American research, I'd like to share with you the resources that you can find here in Northwest Library's Genealogy Department. In print, we have local family histories, state census records, city directories, local land records, local history information, vital statistics, and all kinds of other information. We have state materials for many states, particularly in the Southeast. Within each state, the county materials are organized in alphabetical order. Before you come to research, try to determine the geographic area that your ancestor lived in. But feel free to come even if you don't know anything yet, and I'll help you get started. Most of our collection is searchable on the Pines catalog located on the library website. We have DVDs of many seasons of Finding Your Roots and African American Lives that you can check out and watch at home. You can find out what genealogy books we have both in the genealogy department, but of course those books don't check out, and also in regular circulation that you can check out. You can learn a great deal by reading case studies from Finding Oprah's Roots and Finding Your Roots by Henry Louis Gates. These case studies give you great ideas and real-life scenarios, and we also have some basic how-to genealogy books that you can check out. Now, our microfilm resources, we have 50 big drawers of microfilm records. We have over 3,000 rolls of microfilm. We have census records for 13 states, including the Georgia slave schedules and agricultural schedules for 1850 and 1860. We have county court records on microfilm from 19 counties in southwest Georgia, and some of these are records that have not been digitized. We have the Alabama Death Index from 1908 to 1959, South Carolina marriages after 1842, and South Carolina wills for 5 counties. We've got the Mississippi Death Certificate Index from 1912 to 1941. We've got Confederate pardon applications, and we even have the Adjutant General's salt distribution records for 1862 through 1864. Our electronic resources include Ancestry Library Edition, Heritage Quest, Galileo, the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps for Albany, digitized Albany City directories, American Ancestors by the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and many others. We are now a Family Search affiliate library, which means that you can access Family Search records here that you cannot access on your own free subscription from home. I'm glad to answer questions and provide help as you research at the library. I have some special caveats for you regarding African American electronic research. If you can't find your ancestors' information in a database, it does not mean that there are no records. It could mean that the records were not digitized. They might exist at a courthouse or a state or federal archives and were not included in the database or the index. Keep in mind that only 5 to 7% of genealogy records have been digitized, and this is true no matter what race, nationality, or ethnic background you're researching. So sometimes you might have to travel to state and national archives, courthouses, and graveyards as you're doing your research. Northwest Library's Genealogy Department provides research, instructional, and outreach services. I can give you suggestions, research guidance, and even some research assistance as much as I can. I teach monthly genealogy classes that are posted on the library's Facebook page. I outreach to civic groups interested in genealogy. Next month, I'm going to be doing a genealogy merit badge workshop for the South Georgia Boy Scout Council. I support local genealogy clubs, and before COVID-19, we allowed them to meet in the genealogy department, but now we're having to do that by WebEx. I'd love to see a chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society form here in Albany. Right now, the only chapter that they have is in Atlanta. I'm so glad you've joined me in exploring African American genealogy research. Please feel free to email me atlalford@docolive.org or call me at 229-420-3204. If you email me, I would be glad to send you a copy of these slides and also my African American genealogy websites list. I'd love to walk alongside you as you continue your genealogy journey. Thanks for coming.